So, in our previous studies, we saw in both Ezekiel 31 and in Amos 2 that there is specific mention made of roots of trees. When we see the image of a tree, we know that it's a metaphorical because a literal tree does not rule, but it's always used consistently, and we're going to find it used in the New Testament consistently with the Old Testament as well. And some of that imagery, we see the tree, the ruler and the people under him, not the government structure itself, but the people within that government. And that doesn't apply. That applies if it's a church government, state government, national government, whatever it is. The height represents the authority. The taller the tree, the more the authority. The branches represent the different areas of authority. The shadow represents the influence over the region. The fruit represents the subjects of the kingdom. The roots represent the stability or the lineage of that tree. The water is a source of nourishment and strength. The birds are the evil spirits or those who are influenced by them in the physical world. And that's important. Even whenever we're talking about a church, the birds represent less than desirable aspects of this government authority. And then we see the beasts, which are the evil spirits that are active in the physical realm. Now, there are several different aspects of trees that are used in type, and anytime you read about trees, stop and think about what you're reading. Don't just brush past it. Many people turn these into the refrigerator magnet sermons that look good when you put them on a magnet and stick them on your refrigerator, but often it misses the point entirely by ignoring the context and by ignoring the types and presenting things that sound really nice. Now, right now, we are concentrating on the source of the power, which is the roots. Now, there is specific mention of the roots. The roots are where the trees draw water in order to grow. By the same token, this illustrates how spiritual forces associated with the deep and with the earth, which are the underground realms of the dead, are connected to the people above. In Ezekiel 31:4, the water has made him, and this is talking about the Assyrian, but the water has made him great. The deep set him up on high with her rivers running around about his plants, and sent out her little rivers unto all the trees of the field. So these waters make the kings great in the land of the living. And I know we keep coming back to this verse, but I want us to look at it one more time. And I would encourage you to print out this verse and put it somewhere visible because we are entering into an age in which this is more important than it has been in a very long time. This is Ephesians 6:12. This is taken out of the Geneva Bible. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, and against worldly governors, the princes of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness which are in the high places. Now, the Geneva Bible is not the only translation that translates this verse in this manner. There are others. The King James Version, which is my preferred translation because I'm most familiar with it, has certain restrictions placed upon the translators. One of those restrictions is that they could not make the king look bad, or they couldn't translate anything that would weaken his authority. Therefore, they had to obscure what is said here. And I'm not teaching anything new here. I'm just bringing some forgotten issues back into the open. This used to be openly discussed, and then it was kind of like brushed aside. And none of what I teach is new, but much of it is made up of things that have been subverted intentionally or just simply forgotten. But this verse is not referring merely to world rulers. This has to do with the powers that are behind the rulers. Not every politician is bad. Not every politician is evil. Some have good intentions and some do much good. But the vast majority of them, many of them at least, they have these dark powers behind them. And those who say Christians should avoid politics are either liars or they're unfamiliar with what the Bible says about the issue. However, there are powers that work behind the scenes, working through human rulers to gain power for themselves. Now, why would people do this? They want to gain power for themselves. Now, this is a symbiotic relationship. The humans gain power, and the princes of the darkness of this world gain power. And these dark powers will discard the humans as soon as they become a hindrance. And I'm sure that you can think of some examples of this that have been in the news recently. Now, the powers that made the Assyrian the ruler of much of the known world, those powers came from the abyss, came from Tartarus. Ezekiel says that these waters made the Assyrian great. And this word translated as made great can be used variously as magnify, nourish up, make powerful, and other shades of meaning. Job chapter 26, verse 5 says that dead things are formed from under the waters and the inhabitants thereof. The Bible's all tied together. And this word for waters that we're looking at is the same word that's used in Job 26:5. The rivers are used for rivers or seas, whereas little rivers has to do with irrigation canals. In other words, the waters from which the dead come will be spread out both naturally and intentionally. Now, the deep is the same place from which the flood waters came in Genesis. So when you see this expression, the deep, this has to do with spiritual power. This has to do with more than just simply the river that's out there or the ocean that's out there. But it's the same place from which the floodwaters came in Genesis. Now, the power that made the Assyrians so great came from the abyss. The Septuagint calls the abyss the abuso. In Genesis 10:8, it says, "And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one, or a giant, a Gibor in the earth." So what made Nimrod, what made the Assyrian so great? The waters made him great. The dead who came from the waters. And the phrase made him great is from the word Gadol, which is from the same root as Gadol. Both are written as GDL, or the Hebrew equivalent of GDL, because the original Hebrew had no vowels. Now, the Gadol is the word that's used for the twisted tassels that are sewn into the corners of traditional Israelite garments. And don't confuse the Gadol with the tzitzit, which most translations tend to translate them both as tassels. Numbers 15:38 says, "Speak unto the children of Israel," talking to Moses here, says, "Speak unto the children of Israel, and bid them that they make fringes, make tzitzit, on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and that they put upon the fringe of their borders a ribbon of blue." Most of the English translators, they use tassels and fringes, no matter whether the Hebrew uses tzitzit or Gadol. They translate two different words the same way. Well, the word tzitzit means lock, and Gadol means twisted threads. And modern English-speaking people tend to use the words interchangeably, but they're not the same thing. There's imagery here. In this passage in Numbers 15:38, this word tzitzit is used, and it's more appropriately a lock, as used in Ezekiel 8:3, which says, "And he put forth the form of a hand and took me by a lock of mine head." So in the passage in Numbers, Moses is not telling them to make a tassel or a fringe because the word is lock. Moses is telling them to do one thing and it will become something else. As an example, in Exodus 28:36, they're told to make a plate of pure gold and engrave holiness to the Lord on it. And then in Exodus 29:6, the gold plate becomes a crown. Here in Exodus 28:36, it says, "And thou shalt make a plate of pure gold, engrave upon it like the engravings of a signet, holiness of the Lord." And then in 29:6, "And thou shalt put a mitre or a turban upon his head, and put the holy crown upon the mitre." So the gold plate became a crown. It wasn't a crown when they started, but it became one. In Numbers 15:38, the lock is not called a Gadol because it does not yet have that name because it's not yet been created. In Exodus 28:36, the plate is not yet called a crown because it's not yet been created. There's a consistency going here. My son creates things out of metal. He makes some custom smokers in which to smoke meat. When they dig the ore out of the ground, it's not yet steel, but it becomes steel. When it's steel, it's not yet a smoker. But when he crafts the metal and he puts the firebox and the legs on it, it becomes a smoker. So first God made man, then he called him Adam. God made the animals, then Adam named them. Now, the Gadol and the tzitzit are not the same. So this is a fringe here. This would be the tzitzit. At the bottom right-hand side, you can see the tufts of the uh, fiber that's been twisted into thread. And here you see the finished product where they've got it sewn onto the bottom of their garment. They've twisted it into the garment, and there it is. Now in Deuteronomy 22:12, this is from the Lexham translation of the Septuagint. It says, "You shall make twisted braids for yourself on the four edges of your cloak that you throw around yourself." Now, most commentaries and even the notes from the NET Bible, which is usually really good, they say that this is two different words, but say that they're the same thing. They're not the same thing. The Holy Spirit uses very specific words for specific reasons. In the book of Numbers, it's called a lock, and in Deuteronomy, it's called twisted threads. Through man made tradition, a lock has become used as twisted threads. We would not call flour bread, and we would not call steel a smoker. Flour has to become bread, steel has to become a smoker, a gold plate has to become a holy crown, and a tzitzit has to become a gadol. Gadol is the name of the final product. It's twisted together. If you go to dictionary.com, it tells you that a lock in this context is a small tuft or portion of wool, cotton, flax, etc. Or it's a tress, a curl, or a ringlet of hair, which is the way that it was used in Ezekiel above. It is not yet a tassel. You take the tuft and you have a lock, and you can make it into a gadol. It was a time-consuming process for the Israelites, but we don't think about this process today because somebody in China is going to make it for us and we're going to buy it at the discount store. Few people know about this process, or at least they don't think about the process, and that's why the terms are confused. Most of us don't process anything because most things are made in factories or they're made by individual artisans, and we as people are separated from the process. We no longer have in our mind what is being described here. When's the last time you planted and grew a garden or made your own clothing? Have you ever tried to make something as simple as a pencil? There's a book written by Leonard Reed called I Pencil, and I will post a link for it in the description here. But making a pencil is not a simple thing. You hold it in your hand, you pay just a few cents for it. But if you were to make it, you have to take wood, you take the graphite, you take the rubber and aluminum, to hold the little eraser on. But first, you have to mine the aluminum ore, you have to grow the trees, you have to harvest the rubber, things like that. We're separated from these things. But the Israelites, they had to grow the wheat, they had to harvest the wheat, they had to grind the wheat, then they had to bake the wheat. They were involved in the entire process. They grew the grapes, they harvested them, they mashed them in the juice, and then they fermented them just right to make wine. That's how they would know what Moses meant when he said, make a lock. We need to get this back in mind. He was not telling them to make a tassel because he used the word lock. And it's the beginning of what they're going to make. It's going to become a gadol, which is twisted threads. Now, if you know the laws that were given to the Israelites, the gadol is going to be made of the same material as the clothing to which is going to be attached. Leviticus tells them to not mix materials in their garments. We usually completely ignore that detail, but the Israelites paid attention to it. And Moses didn't make an exception for it here. So if they're going to wear linen, they would make the gadol of linen. If they had a wool coat, it would be wool. If cotton, cotton. There were no specific instructions on what material to make it from because they already knew this rule. So the tassels that resulted from these locks, they would remind the Israelites of their allegiance to Yahweh. Blue is a Levitical color, and it has to do with things of God. Blue is found throughout the tabernacle to represent the sacred and the divine nature of Yahweh, and to show this was his dwelling place. So in the gadol, in this tassel, the threads are twisted together. They don't become one big thread. They have the one blue thread running through it, but all the threads can be separated. The common threads, they represent humanity, and the blue thread represents God's divinity. This Gadol was to remind the Israelites that their allegiance was to Yahweh and that he dwelt among them. Now, while the Israelites were forbidden to mix different things, God was exclusively permitted to do so. He could mix things. The Israelites were not even permitted to sow two different crops in the same field, but even the cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant were hybrid creatures. The Israelites were not permitted to mix fabric material, but the ephod that the high priest wore was made of linen and gold mixed together. An ox and a donkey could not be hitched together, but God has both seraphim and cherubim before his throne. Only God is permitted to make his dwelling with the people because he can mix. And I'm thankful for that, for one. But these mixtures of elements is something that's theological. It's applicable to what we think about when we read the Bible. First of all, the different parts all have significant meanings, which are not for this study, but it's something for you to look at later. But secondly, they show that the Most High lives among you. He's one with his people. He is holy, and you're expected to be holy. You have to obey his law. This is God's place, and if you don't obey his law, this is still God's place, and he will still live here. You won't. You'll be somewhere else that you don't want to be. So he uses imageries of mixtures that only he is permitted to do, and this demonstrates his desire for fellowship with human beings. Other gods are not permitted to do the same thing. That is not their domain. That's why the spirits of the dead Nephilim, the demons, are called unclean spirits. Their origin is a forbidden mixture between human women and angels. These demons are an abomination, just as the Rephaim are an abomination. Like the Nephilim, they cross a boundary that they were not supposed to cross. The Nephilim cross the boundary between heaven and earth, and the Rephaim cross the boundary between the dead and the living. They are twisted threads in an unholy alliance. Other examples of imagery of twisting to describe this sort of relationship between gods and men are the coiling serpent, such as with the Greek demigod Asclepius, which is represented by a serpent twisted around a rod. Bear with me just a moment to bring that picture up here. Now, it should be noted that the god of healing, Asclepius here, was represented by a rod that had one serpent on it. Modern medicine, at least in America, not worldwide, but in America, has two serpents on it, which incidentally was used by the god of commerce, not the god of healing. That kind of says a lot about where our society has gone on this. But this being here, Asclepius, was the son of Apollo and was believed to have healing powers. Because of this, temples that were dedicated to him were healing places, such as Pergamus, which the book of Revelation calls the throne of Satan. Another location was Meropis, which is an island named after the Rephaim. And at the base of Mount Hermon is the grotto of Pan, is a place called Benias. And this is an imagery of Pan here. And this area was also called the gates of hell. This is where the Watchers first came down, according to 1st Enoch, and Pan was believed to be able to multiply himself, creating many little Pans due to his sexual deviancy. When you're thinking about Pan, something we're going to be looking at in the near future is going to involve some of this imagery here. There's a modern imagery called Peter Pan, who was a Pan, but he has been packaged for children to make him more child-friendly. You're probably more familiar with a different version than I posted here, but this version is not copyrighted, so I can post it here. Ezekiel 31:4. The waters made the Assyrian great. This word great is Gadol. The waters made him twisted threads. The waters made him great. The deep set him up on high with her rivers running round about his plants and sent out her little rivers unto all the trees of the field. So this word Gadol, as we saw, is related to twisting and shows that there is divine in mind when we in the modern world wouldn't recognize it because we're separated from these things. It was not Yahweh who made the Assyrian great, but his greatness came from the deep. He was twisted together with the fallen God. Nimrod had twisted himself with the evil from the abyss, and he had become the first of the Rephaim. There was a supernatural power behind Nimrod. And how do we know this? The title, the Assyrian, is written the same as you would write the national name of Assyria. Sometimes this phrase is simply referring to the nation by referring to the title of the leader as the head of the nation, such as if you refer to somebody as a prime minister, that would represent whatever nation you're speaking of. Sometimes it simply cannot be read in the plain sense, though. In Isaiah chapter 10, verses 12 through 14, it says, "Wherefore it shall come to pass that when the Lord hath performed his whole work upon Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, I will punish the fruit of the stout heart of the king of Assyria, and the glory of his high looks. For he says, By the strength of my hand I have done it, and by my wisdom, for I am prudent. And I have removed the bounds of the people, and have robbed their treasures, and I have put down the inhabitants like a valiant man. And my hand hath found as a nest the riches of the people, and as one gathereth eggs that are left, have I gathered all the earth. And there was none that moved the wing or opened the mouth or peeped." This phrase here, I want you to pay attention to it, the bounds of the people. This is a direct reference to Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 9. It says, "When the Most High divided the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the sons of God. For the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob is the lot of his inheritance." The bounds of the people is a direct reference to this. Now, the Assyrian is specifically working to reverse the decree of Yahweh in the dividing of the nations. Nimrod started an action at Babel, and the Assyrian is continuing the pursuit of that action. Once again, man rebelled under pagan authority, but this only works if there is one who has a higher rank in the council of the gods. Who could do that? Ezekiel 18:16. "By the multitude of thy merchandise they have filled the midst of thee with violence, and thou hast sinned. Therefore I will cast thee as profane out of the mountain of God, and I will destroy thee, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire." Who could do that? Satan himself. So when you read these passages, along with Isaiah 10 and Psalm 82, we can see the lack of justice that the angels are charged with, and we can understand the gradual corruption of the sons of God. We can understand how they affect humanity, and not just individuals or small groups, but they can influence entire nations and even entire civilizations. And because of what we're told of the Assyrians' power, there's little doubt about who this is referring to. Isaiah 14:25 says that I will break the Assyrian in my land, and upon my mountains tread him under foot. Then shall his yoke depart from off them, and his burden depart from off their shoulders. So Isaiah 14 equates Satan with the king of Babylon, then changes to the Assyrian. And it's all about the supernatural power behind the scenes, not about the actual people themselves. To use modern terminology, this is the swamp. The destruction of the Assyrian will occur in Israel, but that's not historical. That never happened in the past. Therefore, it's prophetic. And are there any other prophecies that are about this same event? Isaiah 31, verses 8 through 9. And this is from the New American Standard. "And the Assyrian will fall by a sword not of man, and a sword not of man will devour him. So he will not escape the sword, and his young men will become forced laborers, and his rock will pass away because of panic, and his princes will be terrified at the standard, declares the Lord, whose fire is in Zion and whose furnace is in Jerusalem." God has the long game in view. not just the immediate, but the long view. And for that matter, the powers of darkness have the long game of view too. We as humans, we have a short attention span. We don't pay attention to what's going on. We don't pay attention to what happened 1,000 years ago, 200 years ago. We don't pay attention to what happened last week half the time. But God and the powers of darkness, they both do. They look down the road. The time between the days of Nimrod and the future defeat of the Assyrian tells us that this enemy is not mortal. Nimrod was empowered by this being called the Assyrian, and this enemy has a long history, past and future. The type that is used speaks of Assyria and their conquest of Babylon and Israel, but the context refers to the power behind it all due to the long period of time. Now, a few minutes ago, we saw that the title Rephaim has the idea of being joined or twisted together. Well, the name Leviathan comes from Levi, which means joining, and Dan, which means a serpent. It implies joining a person to someone or something else, usually with the end result being slavery to debt or bound against one's will. In both the Bible and in extra biblical works, the Amorite kings, beginning with Nimrod, were all joined with Leviathan. You say, preacher, that's a bit of a stretch, isn't it? Not really. It's logical and it's consistent. In the Bible, Leviathan is the same as the Canaanite Lotan and the Akkadian Tiamat. Tiamat is the goddess of the Salt Sea, which is the realm of chaos. And this feminine connotation is the same that we saw in Ezekiel 31:4. Now, in most ancient Near East cultures, the creation myths tell of a great dragon who was present at creation, and it was defeated in divine combat, which resulted in the formation of the world. And without spending too much time on details here, the Sumerians and the Akkadians told of Marduk fighting against Tiamat, Baal against the sea and the seven-headed Lotan. In Babylon, Marduk cuts Tiamat in half, and one half becomes the heavens, and the other half becomes the earth. Now, the Old Testament uses this same imagery to show that it was Yahweh who defeated Leviathan, or defeated Rahab, which is the same word, or is the same as it's a name in a different language that says the same thing. And it uses terminology such as breaking, cleaving, scattering, drying the waters. So when the Bible uses the creation myths, it is not to confirm them and to affirm them in the way that they're used, but it simply acknowledges the concepts. In other words, it's saying you've got the right idea, but you're missing the mark on this. They're used in a vague manner, and they're often used sarcastically and satirically, and it does not treat them as being a reality. I mean, the idea is reality. Yahweh, the God of Israel, has defeated this being. That's the important part here. But keep in mind the imagery, which is one of God breaking or cutting the dragon in pieces. This was not the time of the original creation or even the creation of man. How do we know that? Because there were people inhabiting the wilderness at the time. The Amorites were known as wilderness dwellers. And remember back to our previous study, in which calling them wilderness dwellers was a backhanded insult to the Babylonians, because the Babylonians like to think of themselves as civilized because they came from the Amorites, but the Amorites were being called wilderness dwellers, which is not civilized. So they were wilderness dwellers. That was an insult. But they had come from Canaan, which had seas on both sides of it. If you look at the land of Canaan, you have sea over here, the sea over here. Therefore, there's an imagery that was associated with gods of water and with sea monsters in their culture. So when looking at the big picture, and when you're building idea upon idea and image upon image, there is an event that is described in Genesis 11. And this event resulted in the divisions among the sons of God in Deuteronomy 32:8, which we read just a moment ago. And this event is the debacle that happened at Babel. In Genesis 11, verses 6 through 9, and the Lord said, behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon all the face of the earth. Then Psalm 74, verses 13 to 14 says, Thou did divide the sea by thy strength. Thou break the heads of the dragons in the waters. Thou break the heads of Leviathan in pieces, and gavest him to be meat for the people inhabiting the wilderness. Then Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9 again. When the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the sons of God, or the angels of God. For the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. So the meat for the people inhabiting the wilderness is Leviathan. The Lord's portion is Jacob. So this division at Babel, this is the origin of the pagan myths of creation from around the world, not the original creation. The stories all had the same elements. Why do they all have the same elements? Because they were once one people, but they were scattered. And so they brought their stories with them as they went across the world. And of course, man being man corrupted the stories. But even ideas and images that are not brought out until the New Testament are present in most of these cultures. We're just not aware of them today. We don't study them. But the original unity is representative of the people under Nimrod combined together in rebellion against God. Leviathan is that image, and he was broken into pieces. His defeat led to the scattering of the people, and no longer were they gathered as one people under Nimrod to build the center of the one world religion. And you have to think to yourself, is this where we are today? We're gathered into cities. We're building religious centers to the one world religion of state. And as believers, what are you doing about it? What am I doing about it? What are we doing about it? This origin of all the different people groups was the Babel event. They took these stories with them. And as modern humans, we're looking at this from a physical perspective, and we should be looking at it as a spiritual perspective. The world has lost its way spiritually. The church, by and large, has abandoned its spiritual perspective. If you go to church, everything is just affirmation of your feelings. Oh, God loves you. That's a true statement. But it falls short. God expects you to be holy. We must preach sin, we must preach repentance, and we must preach holy living. And with a proper spiritual worldview, we can see the power struggle between the Most High and the twisting serpent as the creation event of the nations. When we understand this language and we understand this imagery about the defeat of Leviathan by Yahweh, it's simple to see the connection between Genesis 1, the Psalms, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Job, and other places in the Bible. In Genesis 1, when God creates each new thing, he gives it a function. The plants are for eating. The stars are for making seasons, on down the line. And the creation myths follow the same pattern. However, when history gets to Babel, things change. The nations of the world are divided among 70 lesser gods. And why is this important? Because the focus of ancient people was not on scientific issues, but their focus was upon religious and political issues that were expressed in terms of function and purpose. They really didn't care where dirt came from. The dirt simply was there. They were interested in whose dirt it was. The question is, who's in charge here? That's what they wanted to know, because if somebody was in charge, then that object has a purpose. And if it has a purpose, that implies a function. Function determines existence. And this is the way the ancients would have understood things. Therefore, it's the way that we must look at things. We have to look at it this way. Now, this doesn't mean that the Bible contradicts anything about observable science. In fact, the Bible tells us to use the book of nature to study the things of nature. The Bible says nothing about the age of the earth. It doesn't say anything about the age of the universe, or for that matter, it doesn't tell us how dirt came into being, although science does. Now, while these things are not important to the narrative that we're looking at here, They also don't contradict observable reality because God is truth. He's not a trickster. God doesn't want you to lose. He's not trying to trick you into losing your faith by something like this. But look at it the way that it was written. To ancient people, something does not exist unless it has a purpose. What this means is that the creation stories of these different cultures and their cosmology, the way they look at the universe, all these nations, is not their own story of the origin of the matter of the universe. It's how they explained their own national deity and how that deity established order in the land, or what they would call their earth. The earth is only functional to an ancient person if it's their own land, which is subject to their purpose. The land elsewhere doesn't matter. And for all intents and purposes, it doesn't exist to them. And as modern humans, we have a tendency to view the creation myths as showing a God defeating a chaos monster, or as we would say, Yahweh defeating Leviathan and creating a material world. The authors of the Bible showed Yahweh is defeating Leviathan and the forces of chaos at Babel. When he divided the people at Babel, he divided the land as well, and he put the members of his divine council as rulers over them. And the territorial dominions of the sons of God became the nations, and each one had their own story about how their deity subdued and ordered their nation. Functionally, each land is the whole earth to that people, and their God is in charge of it. The land and the God, and this is God with a little g, the land and their deity is inseparable. The God is a territorial entity, and the earth only functions as land if there's somebody who's in charge. Now, this doesn't mean that the demons that are stuck in one land. The demons are the spirits of the dead Nephilim. They're in every nation, and it doesn't matter if it's a big nation, a small nation. They're everywhere. They seem to be able to move about a little bit more, have more mobility, but they're also very self-destructive, and they're going to destroy whoever it is that they're tormenting as well. Now, in pagan myths, the land does not appear until the god has defeated the dragon of chaos, because there's no land to speak of when chaos exists and no one's in charge. And you say, but what about Genesis 1? Does this mean that that's only referring to Israel since they're Yahweh's portion? Yahweh's creation story in Genesis 1 happened prior to Babel. Yahweh is first among the gods. Yahweh is one of many Elohim, but no other Elohim is Yahweh. He is unique. Genesis teaches that Yahweh created the heavens and the earth before the earth was divided. That means that he is supreme to all these other divine beings, and he cannot be compared to them. He's incomparable. He owns the universe because he made it. And this means that all the other gods are subservient to him. He is the God who has always been. As the Bible tells us, he is the I am. Who's in charge? Yahweh. The heads of Leviathan were cut off at Babel. Leviathan represents both unity and rebellion against God, as well as chaotic individualism at the same time. He will destroy anyone and everyone in order to win. And he is by nature conspiratorial. If you see conspiracy theories, Satan was the originator of conspiracies, and people will use that as a pejorative term to imply that something is not true. But just because it's a conspiracy doesn't mean it's not true. It always takes more than one person to make a conspiracy. And Satan is not finished yet. His employees are not finished. The fallen angels that fell with him, they're not finished. The demons are not finished. The fallen angels are still busy. The demons are more industrious than ever. And this doesn't mean that you should see them everywhere, but neither should you ignore them where they are. You have to use discernment. Now, historically, we're not quite finished with the earthly historical timeline of these beings. However, time is growing short. The spirit world is busy, and we need to be busy. With that in mind, we're going to look to the present, our current present, into the future and the activities of these demons and the return of these gods. And with that in mind, we're going to look at their methods beginning next week. We're going to be looking at doctrines of demons. What are doctrines of demons? Well, the answer to that may surprise you. Now, I normally don't try to self-promote this channel, but because of social media algorithms, you may not be updated when we post a new video, and we want to get this message out. So please check back manually. Even if you subscribe, check back manually and look for new material and spread the word to your friends and family. Have a great day.